In part one of our lesson on an introduction to the French Revolution, we went through and gave you a good understanding of the social class structure of France before 1789. We looked at the old regime and how the majority of people that were living in France had no money, had no food, had improper shelter, were hungry, and were basically oppressed. All right, they had no rights whatsoever. The second part of the lesson is what we're looking at right now was to look at the causes of the French Revolution, which we included the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, total discontent among the estates, the growth of population, the fact that France was broke. They were absolutely in debt in the 1700s because of war, because of deficit spending. And then we finished the other day with part one of this lesson by simply looking at people in France being ruled by one person forever, starting with the early Franks that came in, taking over parts of the old Western Roman Empire, and just stayed all the way through the King Louis. Now, the other day, we finished with King Louis XV, who ruled from 1715 to 1774, and he was absolutely hated because of all the money that he spent and put France in a huge debt. Let's see what happens today with part two. Well, the person that's going to succeed King Louis XV is King Louis XVI, all right? The grandson of King Louis XV. And at 19 years old, he's going to marry a very famous queen in history called Marie Antoinette. Now, this was a young king, and we always talk about, and we learned about King Louis XIV and how he started ruling when he was 3 or 4 years old. And we came to a conclusion that, 3 and 4-year-olds don't rule countries. They have advisors. And King Louis XVI, who now is in charge of France, did have an advisor, and he was advised by a guy named Jacques Necker. Now, Jacques Necker was a French economist, and he knew that France was in debt. So how do you get a country out of debt? Well, Jacques Necker's advice was to tax the people that had not been taxed really forever. So you take the richest people in France, which at this time was the church, the first estate, and the nobility, the second estate, and you tax them. Well, obviously, this young king making this first move is not going to make a lot of friends in the church, and he's not going to make a lot of friends among the nobility. So what happens? Well, in May of 1789, this young king, King Louis XVI, was forced to call a meeting. And it was a meeting of the Estates General that was to happen at our famous Palace of Versailles that we've done some work on so far. The Estates General is to France as Parliament is to England. It was the governing body of France, where representatives, how it should be, representatives of all of the estates within the old regime should have some say in government. But that was not how it happened throughout the years with the Louis and the absolute monarchs and the kings that had total control. So this young king, King Louis XVI, was forced to have a meeting of all the representatives of all the estates to sit down and try to figure out what we're going to do. So you can see the very famous Palace of Versailles in that one diagram, and you can see an example of what it would look like at a meeting of the Estates General in May of 1789. So the results of the meeting. So all of the representatives from all of the estates came to the Palace of Versailles and sat down to meet with the king. But there was a couple fundamental problems with this meeting from the start. So at 1789, the last time that the members of the Estates General were called together, which were the representatives of all the estates, was 1614. No one was alive at that time. So no one knew how the meeting was supposed to preside. No one knew how the meeting was supposed to go. And no one knew their powers. No one knew what to say at this meeting because the kings never had a meeting of the Estates General. They didn't care what the people thought. Well, now the meeting takes place. Well, all the estates were represented. So there were members of the church, there was members of the nobility, and then there was the members of the third estate, whether you were a peasant or the member of the bourgeoisie or a laborer or an artisan. You had representatives at this meeting there representing your rights and representing what you wanted. Well, the king told them to bring something called cahiers. Cahiers. And a cahier was just a simple notebook. And the king asked that the members of the social classes, the members of what we call the estates, were told to write down their grievances in these little notebooks, in these little cahiers, and then the grievances would be talked about at this meeting. So the church was like, we don't want to be taxed. That would be an example of a typical grievance that they would have. We're not paying taxes. We've never paid taxes before. The nobility would have said, we're not paying more taxes on top of the taxes that we're already paying, and we need a little bit more say in government. Well, the members of the third estate wrote down all kinds of grievances, and one example was that the peasants wanted to be able to shoot deer on their property, or rabbits, or animals. In the past, these people were starving, but they were not allowed to kill animals, to harvest them and eat them and use them, because those were the king's animals. So a typical example of something that the third estate wrote down was, please let us just shoot a deer every now and then. Have a rabbit, shoot a squirrel, so we can eat. And that was a typical grievance that they would have. Well, one central quote that came out of the Estates General in the meeting was that 20 million lives in France lived on half of the wealth, while the church lived on the other half. And as you're thinking about that and looking at that, you probably have an understanding that the people were not too happy that the church was the richest place in all of France and basically didn't have to spend any money in trying to help the French get back out of this debt and help France as a country overall. Well, weeks into the meeting goes nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. The king is listening to these grievances, but not acting. The church, the nobility are listening, but they are not acting. So what happened here was the third estate wanted all of the estates to merge into one national assembly with a constitution. So weeks into this meeting, the members of the third estate, now remember from our lesson the other day, we're talking about 98% of the population of France in 1789 belonged to the third estate, belonged to the lowest group of people that there were in France. Now, so weeks into the meeting, after nothing's happening, the third estate speaks up and says, you know what? Church, nobility, and us. We need to merge into one national government, just like we have here in the United States. We need to call it the National Assembly, and we need to write a constitution. There is the American influence during this French Revolution, because the Americans were getting ready to move towards constitution by this point, okay? And there's the little bit of characteristics of the American Revolution coming back to help the French people. Well, whenever something like this was put on the table, such as the third estate wanting a national government and a constitution, it would go to a vote. It would go to a vote. So the first estate would have a vote, the second estate would have a vote, and the third estate would have a vote. Well, in the history of the voting of the Estates General, the third estate didn't win too much. So when this proclamation went to a vote, the first estate, the church, said, no way, not happening. The second estate, the nobility, said, no chance, we're going to be equal to a peasant. It's not happening. And obviously the third estate voted in favor of this. So basically that's what would have happened. Everyone would have been equal underneath a national government with a constitution. And the first two estates did not want that to happen. So on June 17, 1789, the third estate is going to say, you know what? We have strength in numbers. There's 98% of us here in France. This is what we're going to do. A few weeks into the meeting, the third estate steps up after they lost this vote and said, well, guess what? We're going to declare ourselves to be the National Assembly. And they invited the church, they invited the nobility to help write them a constitution. So they took it upon themselves and said, guess what, Mr. King, Mr. Church, and the nobility? We are now in charge of France. We are now the National Assembly. And the one thing that they did once again was they did invite the other two groups to join them and offered to help them write a constitution. Okay? Well, you can imagine the king, the church, and the nobility were not too impressed by this. So this is what happened. So days later, After the Third Estate declared themselves to be the National Assembly, the estates were supposed to meet back at the Palace of Versailles. So days after this happened, King Louis XVI actually locked every single door in the palace and did not let any member of the estates enter the palace to continue this meeting of what they called the Estates General. Now, on June 20th of 1789, there's a very, very famous event in French history. A very famous oath was taken in French history, and it was called the Tennis Court Oath. Well, this image was a very famous painting outside the Palace of Versailles. The members of the estates were outraged that they were locked out of the palace. And the members that day found themselves to be on a tennis court. And yes, the French were playing tennis for a very long time. The Palace of Versailles had tennis courts for my tennis players in the crowd. This image shows one person standing up in the middle, which would basically be a person that was reading off the oath, and you need to focus on the three men right below him, arm in arm, which represented members of each estate. You can see a bishop there, you can see a member of the nobility, and you can see a peasant locking arms and taking an oath. And this was the tennis court oath. The tennis court oath was that we will not stop fighting until we have a national government, which they called the National Assembly, and a written constitution for the country of France. After this was read off, the members of the church, the members of the nobility were all in, and it was their job to go through and create a national government now and write a constitution. Well, you can imagine that King Louis XVI was not very impressed by that. And this is how the story continues. So after the tennis court oath was taken, that's going to bring us to maybe the most famous event in all of French history, and there's been a bunch of them. So we won't say the most famous, but we'll say the most influential, okay? On July 14, 1789, there was an old medieval castle which in Paris had now turned into a royal prison, and it was called the Bastille. On July 14, 1789, there's a very famous event called the storming of the Bastille, where about 800 Parisians, people from Paris, are going to surround the Bastille wanting its surrender. Well, the king had already moved royal troops into the city of Paris, knowing that after the tennis court oath was taken, there was going to be a possible uprising. So the king moved troops in and looked to dissolve this uprising. Well, the reason why the people were surrounding this royal prison is because there were rumors that the king housed weapons in the basement of this Bastille, this royal prison. And if they were going to fight the king and the king's army, they needed weapons. They needed weapons. So on this day, 1789, you have about 800 Parisians are going to be outside the Bastille, surrounded it. Now, on one side of the prison, there were guards. There were guards all over the prison. On one side, guards had surrendered and were letting people into the Bastille peacefully for a peaceful surrender. On the other side of the Bastille, they did not get the message that the one side had surrendered. And one guard happened to open fire into the crowd. And the crowd went from pretty peaceful to absolute rage after that guard shot a musket into the crowd, killing people. Now, those 800 Parisians then, in turn, stormed the Bastille. Now, over to the right, you can see that there are cannonballs blowing open the Bastille because, as I'll tell you in a second, I want you to look at the image there. The soldiers that were in charge of guarding the Bastille actually joined the people and turned their cannons on the fortress, okay? Now, this is a major event, so go ahead and put a star on this because this is the immediate cause of the French Revolution. This is why it happened, okay? There's a 4-hour battle. As I told you, the soldiers are going to join the cause. They turned the cannons on the fortress. One thing that the people were competing for that we'll read here in a second is they wanted to find the leader of the prison. Because if you were the leader of the Bastille, you were leader of the king's prison. So you were the right-hand man of the king. And at this point, nobody cared for the king. So anytime that you see the leader of the prison, his name was the Marquis de Launay, you literally see his head on a spike because the people of France stormed the Bastille. They didn't, by the way, find any weapons. There were no weapons in the basement, but they did find this guy. And they took him out and they cut his head off and they put his head on a spike. And for the rest of that day, July 14, 1789, the people of France took this guy's head and paraded it around the streets of Paris, basically being a symbol of their freedom, being a symbol of their independence. Now, taking that a step further, July 14th, 1789, in French history, is their Independence Day. It's just like July 4th, okay? 1776 is our Independence Day. That was the day that the American colonists declared independence from the British. July 14, 1789 is when the people of France are going to declare independence from their own king. From their own king. And July 14th is called to this day Bastille Day. It is the French Independence Day. And you talk about a party. My gosh, if you look at these images, you can see that on one of the main streets in Paris that we will, by the way, see again. So remember that image down in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. There are military flyovers, the flag, such an Independence Day. That night, the fireworks go off around the Eiffel Tower. I've heard it's just a beautiful sight. And because of the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, another direct result of this is French Independence Day, which to this day, they call Bastille Day.